On February 26, 1942, the ship sailed out of a harbor clogged with wreckage, beaten docks, flames, and the smell of burning oil soon before nightfall. Dutch women, children, and elderly men, the majority of whom were relatives of the departing crews, waved their men goodbye and good luck. There were responses from the departing ships, American and Dutch sailors cheering and playing bugles, British and Australian warships raising their massive battle-white ensigns fore and aft, and the loudspeaker system of the heavy cruiser HMS Exeter blasting the well-known hymn, "A Hunting We Will Go." In order to prevent a large Japanese force from assaulting the capital island of the 300-year-old Dutch colony, a combined force of American, Australian, British, and Dutch warships was leaving Surabaya harbor in the Dutch East Indies. All hope of halting the Japanese approach rested on this jumble of vessels. Japan's forces had shown to be nearly unbeatable since the Pacific War began. The Emperor's forces had annihilated all of his rivals from Hawaii to Singapore, taking control of Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, and the majority of the Philippines. Their tendrils were now encircling Java, the Dutch East Indies administrative center, and their main aim in the invasion of Southeast Asia, like the tentacles of a giant octopus. On their way to the opposite ends of Java were two prongs of Japanese battleships, transports laden with skilled combatants and formidable planes. In preparation for Japan's attack on Java, the Allies established ABDA, their first combined command, to coordinate the American, British, Dutch, and Australian forces. Due to its unplanned character, the absence of Allied soldiers, and the Japanese onslaught, this attempt at a single command was doomed from the beginning. Before acknowledging that the plan was a failure, British Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wavell, who was in charge of ABDA from Java, could only watch in horror as Japanese troops swept into Singapore, Sumatra, the Celebes, Borneo, and Timor. Dutch Admiral C.E.L. Helfrich was left to lead a small and ill-equipped group of British, Dutch, American, and Australian soldiers, airmen, and sailors when he retreated to Ceylon. That was due to good reasons. The King's Netherlands Indies Legion, a seasoned army that had defended the colony against native uprisings for generations, was one of the best Dutch forces in the Indies. Additionally, their long-serving sailors operated modern destroyers, highly effective submarines with functional torpedoes, unlike their American counterparts, two tough light cruisers, the East Indies Fleet flagship De Ruyter and her older sister Java, while the Dutch airmen flew subpar aircraft like Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters that were easy prey for Japan's agile Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Constructed especially for action in the East Indies, De Ruyter was outfitted with two seaplanes, depth-charge launchers, torpedoes, and the advanced Hasemeyer fire control system for her 10 40mm anti-aircraft guns and 7 5.9-inch cannons. De Ruyter's time has finally arrived. She would not be Java's sole defender. The remaining warships from the United States, Australia, and Britain's Far Eastern Fleet. The Asiatic Fleet had been ordered into Abd afloat under Dutch direction, which added more punch. Among the vessels were HMS Exeter, which had escorted the German pocket battleship Graf Spee into Montevideo in 1939, and the heavy cruiser USS Houston, the Asiatic Fleet's long-standing flagship, which was distinguished by her lofty foremast. The Americans sent the ancient light cruiser, Marblehead, and the new Boise. The British supplied the light cruisers Danae, Dragon, and Durban, and Australia supplied the more recent light cruisers Hobart and Perth. The Dutch, Americans, and British also contributed a number of destroyers. Still, there were a lot of flaws. Both the Dutch and British destroyers were quite new vessels. They withdrew the three old British light cruisers. The USS Boise took her radar with her when she ran aground on an unexplored reef, tore up her keel, and had to be brought home. Marblehead was attacked by many bombs and also had to leave. The crew of the American cruiser found that the majority of her anti-aircraft ammunition were ineffective when the Japanese used medium bombers to target Houston. Boise gave Houston all of her AA ammunition before leaving for the stateside yards. After all the combat in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, the heavy cruiser desperately needed it. Even worse, a Japanese bomb had exploded in the base of her aft 8-inch turret after slamming through her quarterdeck. A fire that would have destroyed the ship was averted by the prompt intervention of a seasoned crew, but Java had no facilities to fix the 3 aft 8-inch guns. The 4 navies in question had no uniform language, ammunition, communications, or protocols, which made matters worse. There were still significant discrepancies, even though the British and Australians used the same methods and the Americans, Australians, and British all spoke the same language. To communicate with the captains of his ships, Rear Admiral Carl Dorman, who oversaw ABDA's surface naval forces, had to employ basic radio or flag signals. In plain English, a doorman could indicate with a blinker light, but it was risky in a battle with smoke and confusion. A Dutch liaison officer would then explain his commands to Houston's skipper, Captain Albert Rooks, after he had communicated them to Houston via high-frequency radio. The British and Australians, whose flag signals differed from those of the Dutch and Americans, were not helped by his ability to send them to other American warships via the American talk-between-ships short-range radio. The communication situation was described as farcical by an American officer. Everyone knows you cannot assemble 11 football players who have never seen each other before and go out and beat Notre Dame, stated Lieutenant Harold Hamlin of Houston in a straightforward manner. It went on patrol 2 hours after it was put together. That was all the Allies had, though, and they overcame the odds and the strength of the Japanese. In a success that raised spirits, 4 historic American 4-stack destroyers attacked a group of Japanese transports anchored off Balikpapan in January and sank 3 of them. American and Dutch submarines occasionally sank freighters, and on February 19th, Admiral Doorman personally oversaw a nighttime attack on Japanese cargo in the Badung Strait. Doorman, a 53-year-old native of Utrecht, was one of the first flying teachers in the Dutch Navy, having served as a naval officer since 1910 and a pilot since 1915. He oversaw the aviation arm of the Dutch Navy in 1938. He was given command of the fleet forces in the East Indies after being elevated to Rear Admiral in 1940. He was a seasoned deck sailor who recognized the importance and influence of air power in the contemporary era and approached difficulties rationally and soundly. Using darkness to conceal his approach, attack, and withdrawal, he guided his ships in 3 packs to Badung Strait. From the beginning, there was chaos. One of the Dutch destroyers went down. There was no communication between the 3 packets. The only outcome of the back-and-forth torpedoes and broadsides fired by the Japanese and Allies was the sinking of the Dutch destroyer Piet Hein, the damage to a Japanese destroyer, and the same for the American destroyer Stuart. Stuart was put in a 15,000-ton floating dry dock when Dorman moved his ships home to Cilacap, Java's main naval station. She quickly rolled over on her port side, eliminating both the destroyer and the dry dock from the match. After capturing Java, the Japanese took Stuart and used her as a patrol ship for the remainder of the war. It was challenging for the remaining vessels to be ready for the next round. The number of American destroyers was being reduced. Pope had feedwater leaks. Pillsbury and Parrott needed overhauls. Stuart was gone. Whipple was out of commission due to a collision. And she was losing more water from her condensers than they could absorb. Only 4 destroyers, the Ford, Edwards, Alden, and Paul Jones, all flush-deckers from the 1920s, were available for the Americans to use. They were unable to fire their forward 4-inch cannon at maximum speed or in choppy seas because they lacked a raised forecastle. In an attempt to trick the Japanese into thinking the destroyed 8-inch turret was still in use, engineers on Houston pushed it back into its original place and covered it with a steel roof. In the meantime, Java was overrun by Japanese forces. 56 transports and freighters arrived from the west, protected by a light aircraft carrier, 2 light cruisers, and 4 heavy cruisers. Under the command of Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi, a somewhat ordinary officer by Japanese standards, 41 transports arrived from the east, escorted by 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 7 destroyers. Even greater might was hidden behind this power as deep cover. 9 additional heavy cruisers, a battleship, and the powerful carriers that had destroyed the American battle line at Pearl Harbor. On February 26th, Takagi's crew got to work, assembling a two-column convoy of ships spaced a mile apart and spanning 20 miles. Japanese destroyers found it difficult to maintain order, and the merchant ships were badly managed by untrained civilian sailors. Commander Tameichi Hara, who was irritated by the merchant vessel's lack of discipline, was in charge of the Amatsukaze, one of the tin cans that was shepherding these vessels. They disregarded radio quiet laws, disregarded blackout regulations, and released massive clouds of black smoke. The sea was silvered every night by the brilliant moonlight, while the sun shone brilliantly during the day. Trained eyes could see all the way across the force, even at night. Our surveillance planes had spotted 5 Allied submarines, but none of them posed a threat to our ships. I still don't understand why enemy submarines didn't emerge, Hara wrote afterwards. There was an excellent reason, in fact. Because the American submarines' torpedoes would not cooperate, the sub-skippers were forced to report on Japanese movements, which British code-breaking teams in London and Ceylon verified. Now that Doorman knew this, he could get ready. He remembered the crewmen on Pope cheering enthusiastically as the Anglo-Australian ships steamed in with their white ensigns flying, and he recalled Exeter, Perth, and 3 destroyers from Tanjong Priok in western Java to Surabaya. Her skipper, Captain Oliver Gordon, was called along with his Perth counterpart, Captain Hector Heck Waller, to meet with Doorman and the other senior commanders at Dutch Naval Headquarters, which is located in the requisitioned Netherlands Indies Electricity Company building, after Exeter moored up and changed colors. Everyone arrived dressed appropriately for long-service cops. Every ship captain shook hands with Doorman. There wasn't much to say, but he delivered the briefing in English. Southwest of the Celebes, he planned to strike the enemy convoy after leaving harbor. Houston would not be the final ship in line since her aftergun turret would be knocked out. The top speed of the entire fleet would be 25 knots due to boiler leaks on the Dutch destroyer Kortenaer. With battle flags flying, Doorman's combined striking force set sail from Surabaya on the evening of the 26th, when De Ruyter struck a tug and a water barge in the harbor. Sinking both, but leaving the flagship undamaged, mayhem broke out once more. By noon, the destroyers had run out of gasoline, and they had not discovered any enemy units. He avoided Japanese bomber planes on the way home, as he made his way back to Surabaya to refuel. The Japanese were repelled in part by Houston's new AA gunload. Upon arriving in port, Doorman received signals from Helfrich instructing him to return to sea as soon as the fueling was finished. There was no doubt that the Japanese were approaching. This day, the personnel reached the limit of endurance, the Doorman signaled back. The limit will be surpassed tomorrow. However, on February 27th, at 2:27 p.m., the combined striking force once again set sail after receiving a contact report that placed the Japanese convoy only 90 miles north. Doorman used a simple English semaphore to indicate his ships. "I'm going to intercept an enemy unit. Follow me. Details later." Doorman led the striking force into a column on De Ruyter, followed by Exeter, Houston, Perth, and Java. The American and Dutch destroyers were a distinct column on the cruiser's port and rear quarter, held back by their aging engines and kept back by their flimsy armor, which left them vulnerable to enemy fire. In contrast, the British destroyers sailed ahead of De Ruyter as a screening force. The black smoke was spewed out by the American 4-pipe destroyers. Japanese surveillance aircraft were actively looking for Doorman's unit on the opposite side. Takagi had his own problems. 8 destroyers, including Hara's Amatsukaze, the light cruiser Jinsu, and the heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro, composed his combat group. Although Takagi was tasked with escorting 41 ships and freighters, the two forces were evenly matched. Mystified by Doorman's strange courses and slow advance, 12 knots, Takagi kept a close eye on his movements. That was for a cause. Doorman was worried that his battered ships and weary soldiers might just be ambushed as the afternoon drew on and the Allies lost contact with the Japanese. He made the decision to return to Surabaya once more in order to refuel and load up on ammunition. Doorman entered the outer harbor of Surabaya at 3 p.m. while standing on the bridge of his flagship. It was then that Helfrich signaled to him. North of Surabaya, close to Bawin Island, the Japanese Eastern Force was spotted. Helfrich was giving Doorman orders to strike right away. Even though he and the rest of the fleet were exhausted, Doorman obeyed orders by indicating, "Follow me." The ships shuffled north without refueling, turning back into the prearranged configuration. The adversary is 90 miles distant. The Japanese were watching Doorman's ships as they sailed north. Takagi received the following report from one of Nachi's reconnaissance aircraft. The enemy fleet has turned around again. Now, the double column structure is giving way to a single column. The enemy is accelerating and moving in a 20-degree direction. A communication 10 minutes later verified the Allied speed, which was 22 knots. Takagi responded right away. The remaining observation planes of his cruisers were shot off, and he directed his minesweepers and patrol craft to herd the transports into order and away from the Allied fleet. He then formed a battle line, with the 8 destroyers led by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's light cruiser, Jinsu, followed by another flotilla, led by the light cruiser Naka, and 6 additional destroyers under Rear Admiral Shoji, Nishimura, Nachi, and Haguro. Then came the human preparations. Commanders wore white dress uniforms, and sailors wore working uniforms and helmets. Many men wore hachimaki headbands and said a little prayer at their ship's shrines. And lastly, massive rising sun battle ensigns were broken from every masthead. With ideal sight and a calm sea, the two forces charged each other around 3:30 p.m., setting up the largest surface engagement since the Battle of Jutland in 1916. At 4:12 p.m., Electra reported 1 cruiser, unknown number, large destroyers bearing 330 degrees, speed 18, course 220 degrees. The officers on Exeter initially believed they had sighted the invasion convoy rather than its screen. Electra had spotted Jinsu and Amatsukaze. One of Hara's best lookouts, Warrant Officer Shigeru Iwata, shouted, "Enemy ship!" on Amatsukaze. As everyone looked south via their binoculars, from his recognition books, Hara identified the lead cruiser as De Ruyter, and Iwata verified it, saying, "De Ruyter is 28,000 meters, 20 miles. Closing quickly. "Get ready, gunners and torpedo men," shouted Hara. "The opposing column's lead cruiser is our objective." Hara became aware that he was about to engage in his first significant maritime conflict. Before the other officers could respond, Electra changed the report to read, 2 heavy cruisers, at 4:14 instead of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, 6 destroyers. They were heavy cruisers. Nachi and Haguro then came within range, and at 4:16 p.m., both cruisers unleashed a full broadside at a distance of 28,000 yards using a total of 28-inch guns. The Allied ships responded, with Exeter's failing to train on the Japanese as they attempted to cross Dorman's T, the oldest naval maneuver to achieve tactical superiority since the introduction of gunpowder, and Houston's after-turrets silenced by damage. Then came the communication issues. The senior commander had to give the order before ships in the Royal Navy opened fire, and Dorman had not yet done so. Gordon struggled to decide what to do on Exeter. I could and probably would have raised a very brief flag signal if I hadn't been ordered, asking permission to open fire if we had been with a British senior officer. But in this instance, I was aware of the limitations of intership communication. At 3,000 yards, the first Japanese 8-inch shells failed. The gunners from Japan were overly enthusiastic. Their first surface activity was this. Dorman placed the 3 top British destroyers on the starboard bow of the cruiser and ordered the course to be 20 degrees left to parallel the Japanese ships. Dorman gave the order for the destroyers to move to the port side of the Allied column to wait for their turn with their torpedoes after the Japanese fired shells at Electra. The few bombers the Dutch and Americans had on Java went directly for the transports, despite his radio call to Surabaya for air support. The 2 Allied heavy cruisers opened fire after Dorman delivered the command. Some Japanese officers on Nachi were alarmed by Houston's first short shot's blood-red geysers, and her shells were dyed crimson to aid in spotting. When Houston's guns opened fire, Winslow was flung against a bulkhead, and his soup bowl steel helmet was torn off his head. Winslow, trembling with anticipation, picked up his tin hat and knew that the anxiety of waiting for combat was over. Jinsu led her column straight toward Electra on the Japanese side. Her squad straddled the British warship and began fire at 18,000 yards. Jupiter and Electra straddled the Japanese, opening up at 16,000 yards. Perth, a ship with 6-inch guns near the rear of the Allied line, was the last to commence fire. Waiting for his opportunity to fire in a surface battle was more terrible than having to endure the Luftwaffe's bombing in the Mediterranean, Captain Waller told an officer on the bridge. At 4:29 p.m., 8 minutes later, Dorman shifted course to 248 degrees, allowing the Allied light cruisers to fire and bringing both columns into parallel. They were straddling every ship. As of yet, no one was scoring any hits. An 8-inch shell struck De Ruyter's armored deck at 4:31 and descended into her auxiliary engine room, where it failed to detonate. After Dorman closed the range on a 267-degree course 4 minutes later, Nishimura, on board the light cruiser Naka, gave the order for his 7 destroyers to advance and fire 43 Long Lance torpedoes at the enemy. With the exception of Nachi, whose crew had inadvertently left the stop valve on their compressed oxygen supply open for too long, the rest of the fleet joined in. Houston was known for being among the U.S. Her rangefinders were out of date by the quickly changing standards of World War II, but she had the Navy's greatest gunnery ships. She was devoid of remote control servo motors and radar, which would have allowed crews to train and raise guns without exerting themselves. Visual triangulation of ranges was done. 70 gunners turned wheels to train guns, open breeches, and stuff shells and powder bags in the low red light of the overheated gun rooms. The electro-hydraulic ramming mechanism was disabled on the 5th volley when a fuse box was wrenched loose from the turret 1 bulkhead. It was now nearly difficult for the crew to load and ram the breech by hand during peacetime. However, throughout the conflict, they managed to keep up with turret 2 for 65 salvos until repairs were completed. Lieutenant Winslow observed the dull red glow of exploding shells as he watched the shell fire from above. The troops roared back when Houston, convinced that he had defeated the adversary, shouted into the turrets through a voice tube, "We've just kicked hell out of a 10-gun Jap cruiser." The enemy cruiser appeared to pull away. However, issues with gunnery deflection adjustments were later caused by a frayed electrical line in the forward main gun director, which was exacerbated by the towering foremast housing whipping back and forth. No longer did Houston's gunners and rangefinders know where their shells would land. As this was happening, a Japanese shell struck Houston's main deck under the anchor windlass, sped through the second deck, and exited above the waterline on the starboard side without detonating. An oil tank on Houston's port side was punctured by another hit, but it did not detonate. The Americans questioned whether dud shells also affected the Japanese. Lieutenant Winslow wrote, "Salvo after salvo exploded into the sea around us. The ferocious bursts of enemy weaponry and the sigh of their lethal shells flying toward us like enormous blackbirds captivated me. Exeter, meanwhile, needed 12 salvos to obtain a straddle. Gordon then noticed the orange flare of a shell exploding on the superstructure of a cruiser. He shouted, 'That's a hit!' Although it appeared to be one to everyone, the Japanese cruisers were unharmed in the incident. The destroyer Asagumo did. She was struck by an Allied shell that disabled her engine and killed 5 people while wounded. 19. Exeter, however, did suffer some setbacks. The 4 members of the gun crew were killed at 5:07 p.m. when a shell penetrated the shield of the S2 4-inch gun. All 10 of its crew members were killed as the shell continued to travel through the ventilator of the number 1 boiler room and exploded there. Exeter started to lose speed as steam escaped through the waste pipe. A mighty can opener being driven into the ship was how it felt. Of Exeter's 8 boilers, 6 were rendered inoperable. The cruiser's speed dropped to 11 knots when the electrical power went out. Damage control teams arrived, but entry to the boiler room was not allowed until the next day due to the intense heat from the explosion and superheated steam. Gordon changed his heading to port in order to escape the battle line and prevent a collision, after realizing that his ship could not maintain its position in line at 11 knots. Houston's TBS radio was unfortunately knocked out, and her signal lights were damaged due to the shell fire and concussion. Her halyards and letter flags and the Aldi's lamps she used for signaling were hidden by heavy smoke. From then on, all communication was by flashing lights obscured by gun smoke, smoke screens, and hampered by rapid movements, wrote Commander Henry E. Eccles, the skipper of the destroyer Edwards. Unaware of the situation, believing he had overlooked Dorman's command, Rooks turned to port and followed Exeter in column. Houston had to check fire as the ship turned. While Java followed Houston, Waller, observing the two cruisers in front of him, maneuver and Exeter blow off steam, made his way counterclockwise to the north on Perth to cover the heavy cruiser's withdrawal with a 30-foot wall of smoke that provided them with a reprieve. With no column behind him, Dorman closed Exeter and heeled De Ruyter to port, indicating, "What is your damage?" Gordon retorted, "One boiler room hit." Dorman reorganized the other cruisers on a northeasterly course and gave Exeter the order to sail for Surabaya at a maximum speed of 15 knots. Smoke, squalls, and fog descended on the action before anyone could respond. At 5:20, Dorman retired while attempting to reorganize. It appeared that no one on the Allied side understood what was happening. The crystal ball was our only way to predict Commander Combined Striking Force's intention, Eccles wrote later. Tanaka, however, capitalized on the Allied panic and squalls by directing 8 destroyers to close and charge the enemy behind his cruiser's Jinsu in order to launch shells and torpedoes at the American destroyers, the closest Allied ships. Everyone was buried in smoke in a matter of seconds as the Allied ships opened fire at 7,000 meters. The Japanese side was hit by missed Allied shells, while the American side was covered in smoke screens. As the Japanese approached to 6,000 and then 5,000 meters, an anxious Hara clutched his bridge's rail, his knees shaking and perspiration pouring down his face. Tanaka gave the command for his ships to commence fire at 5:27. "Fire torpedoes!" shouted Hara. The Allied ships turned west as the long lances swished across the sea. When the Japanese torpedo volley eventually got close to its targets, the Dutch warship Kortener was blasted by at least one of them. Survivors, including her skipper, were scattered over the ocean as the 1928-built destroyer jackknifed in two and sank almost instantly. All hands were astonished as the Japanese long-lance torpedo confronted the Allies for the first time in a surface action. Ensign Smith subsequently remarked, "There was only 15 or 20 feet separating her bow from the stern." On Houston, he saw Kortener's two divided parts, resembling the twin towers of a cathedral, slip into the ocean. Beside Winslow, another sailor exclaimed, "Jesus Christ, look at that!" Winslow observed a massive water gus that rose 100 feet into the sky. Later, Kortener's commanding lieutenant commander, A. Croce, observed, "The doctor was sitting on the stern, wearing a steel helmet, a life belt, and a khaki suit. Heavy white clouds were billowing from the ship, and the smoke apparatus had started up as a result of the explosion. Like a fire god, the doctor sat in the middle of everything." The stern eventually rolled over onto its side, and those who were still holding on hurried into the ocean. The Kortener's bows remained upright in the air for a considerable amount of time, but soon half of the ship was gone from view. Many rafts, enough to sustain every survivor, started to float up after the ship had gone down. In order to create a group that would be readily visible to a rescuer, the commander instructed us to connect the rafts together. Our circumstances were anything but comfortable because a thick layer of black fuel oil from the ship's bunkers coated a large portion of the water's surface. Even though the Japanese had only scored one hit out of 64 torpedoes launched, Dorman's battle plan and fleet were in serious difficulty, with Kortener sunk and Exeter badly damaged. Dorman regrouped by turning his flagship to join his other ships. The Allied ships were so far away from the Japanese cruisers that everyone on board questioned how they could have been torpedoed. The Allied skippers assumed there were Japanese submarines nearby, not knowing about the long lance. Nishimura's 4th destroyer flotilla, on the opposite side, turned to port in order to rejoin Tanaka's ships for an additional assault. In order to place his main force between the enemy and the battered Exeter and give that cruiser a chance to escape, Doorman ordered his ships to follow him southeast and then northeast, spitting smoke to mask his movements. Doorman sent in his 3 British destroyers, Electra, Encounter, and Jupiter, to launch separate strikes after realizing he had to attack first, while the Japanese regrouped. They would then escort Exeter to Surabaya aboard the Dutch warship Vita de Veith. The Japanese are launching a powerful torpedo strike against the Exeter. Commander C.W. May informed his men on Electra at 5:25 over the main loudspeaker. In order to retaliate, we are going through the smoke. As this was happening, Exeter's crew brought the steam and guns back up to 15 knots. Her guns then started shooting at Jinsu, which sputtered and dodged Exeter's 8-inch shells. Ahead of her sisters, Electra dashed northwest into the smoke and came out of the haze and darkness to discover Jinsu's pagoda-like superstructure and bulbous funnel tips guiding 6 destroyers in her direction. To the adversary, Gunner Kane felt exposed. The destroyer was rocked by the Japanese's dozens of shells, the most of which were near hits. With the help of seasoned gun crews, Electra returned the fire. However, Electra slowed to a stop after a Jinsu shell struck beneath the bridge, and another one destroyed the boiler room mains. The motionless British ship was being attacked by a Japanese destroyer, but Electra returned fire with torpedoes, although to no effect. They all missed. Gunner Kane fired his turret under local control as Jinsu continued to unload shells into Electra. The guns were soon out. A turret knocked out, B turret evacuated when a fire broke out beneath it, the searchlight platforms were destroyed, a fire broke out aft that prevented the X and Y turrets from receiving ammo, and the ship's motorboat and whaler were destroyed. "Abandoned ship," said Commander May. In addition to saving Exeter and scoring a single hit on Jinsu that resulted in 1 man being killed and 4 more injured, Electra's selflessness bought Encounter and Jupiter the opportunity to emerge from the haze and launch torpedoes against the Japanese. Jupiter and Vita de Veith followed Encounter's skipper, Lieutenant CMDR Morgan, who launched torpedoes and heeled his destroyer hard, over after spotting the swarms of Japanese ships. To protect the shattered cruiser from danger, the 3 tin cans gathered around Exeter. One of Vita de Veith's depth charges escaped during the maneuvers, dropped overboard, exploded abaft, and rocked the ship like a hammer blow, damaging her on the way. Dorman faced yet another looming catastrophe up atop de Ruyter's flag bridge. She grabbed 6 8-inch guns, half of Dorman's arsenal, as Exeter steamrolled away. There were just 6 destroyers left in Dorman after Electra and Courtenay were lost. Dorman adjusted his path so that he was parallel to the heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro on the Japanese side of the smokescreen. With Houston in their sights, the Japanese cruisers closed the range and started shooting. Now that the American ship was running low on ammo, it was her turn to be in difficulty. Houston had only 50 rounds left in each gun after firing 303 rounds per turret during her sortie, without having time to rebunker her magazines. Most significantly, the aft magazine of the ineffective No. 3 turret had the remaining ammunition. The 260-pound projectiles were hand-carried in slings through the tight corridors, up ladders, across decks, and into the 2 forward handling rooms by Chief Petty Officer Otto Schwartz and his shipmates after they had removed grease shells from storage racks abaft. Furthermore, an 8-inch pistol at the time had a 30-round round life. The liners of the gun barrels had slipped out of the weapons by at least an inch after that threshold had been surpassed. It would take hours to touch the rifle casings because they were so hot. The doorman persisted. The Japanese wouldn't either. As the battleships polished off the Allied striking force, the Japanese gave the order for their transports to shift south and aim for the beaches of Java. Jinsu was observed by de Ruyter's afterport lookouts at 6 p.m. The Dutch cruiser fired, but the Japanese were hidden by the smoke and the encroaching dusk. Torpedoes were fired by the Japanese as they got within 4,400 yards of the Allied ships. The officers of the Japanese ships understood that the shells would be returned, so they stooped to avoid them. The torpedoes flew harmlessly past Dorman's ships when he gave the order to turn south after discovering the threat. The conflict continued into dusk, with the sun setting at 6:21. Allied communications deteriorated in the dark, with flags unusable and signal lights damaged by shellfire. At 6:06, de Ruyter used her signal lamps to tell Edwards to counterattack. Shortly after Edwards accepted the command, de Ruyter flashed cancel counterattack and then make smoke. Edwards' commander Binford was perplexed. He had led the American destroyers along the requested track for the counterattack. Binford became even more perplexed when a final signal came. "Cover my retirement." Did you mean to produce smoke? As Java turned away, did it steam across its stern in protection? Binford concluded that a cruiser column's retirement could only be covered by the best U.S. Despite the fact that his ships were 32 years old, he attacked, as is Navy custom. Binford's tin cans rushed in the direction of the cruisers Nachi and Haguro, which were defending the incoming transports and could be seen in the northwest around dusk. "I always knew these old four-pipers would have to go in and save the day," commented a sailor on the bridge of the U.S. destroyer Alden. Takagi watched the American warships come up on Nachi's bridge. In the distance, he could also make out the lighthouse of Surabaya, with its glass windows reflecting the setting sun. By flag signal, Binford gave the command for his ships to launch a torpedo attack. The tin cans almost collided as they sped through the smoke. Binford ordered the barrage of fish as they rushed through and cracked at peak speed, preparing to launch a broadside torpedo strike on the Japanese cruisers to starboard. Then, in order to fire their port tubes at the Japanese, Binford's destroyers made a complete 180-degree turn while continuing to move at full speed. Amazingly, every American torpedo missed. The Japanese averted damage by altering their trajectory to comb the American torpedo tracks. In order to clear the region, Binford gave the order for his ships to run at full speed. They steamed off toward Dorman at 32 knots into the darkness. The Dutch admiral sent Binford a new signal as the destroyers closed with Dorman. "Follow me." Binford was pleased to cooperate, but questioned what was happening at this point. Although the American torpedo attack had not achieved much, it had given Takagi some cause for concern. Although none of his ships had been harmed, the American counter-thrust demonstrated that they were still engaged in combat and could cause additional harm. No one routed them. Takagi sought to predict Dorman's next move, speculating that he may assault the shipments in the north or break off and go to Surabaya for ammunition and fuel. Takagi turned away to protect his transports, worried about the latter option, and broke off the action. After observing Nachi and Haguro turn around, the doorman radioed Helfrich at Lembong around 6:30, saying, "Enemy retreating west. Where is the convoy?" "I don't have any current information," Helfrich radioed. The Japanese on the other side of the lake were also perplexed. Almost every man in Tanaka's destroyer Squadron 2 was disgruntled at the order to break off action, wrote Tami Chihara, the captain of Amatsukaze. "In addition to the fact that our ships had not used as much ammunition as the others, I believed that we had lost the opportunity to engage in a fierce pursuit and eliminate the enemy." Nevertheless, Takagi used the lull to retrieve his 5 seaplanes, which was a challenging task in any situation, much less a war, and left them all but immobile when Dorman's troops returned. The Japanese battleships Haruna and Kirishima of Battleship Division 3, which had been in the Indian Ocean just 2 days earlier, were initially mistaken for the approaching ships by Takagi and his crews. No matter how strong their engines were, it was improbable that such ships could have made it to the Java Sea in that amount of time. When an officer on Nachi's bridge posed that exact query, Commander Ishikawa yelled angrily, "Damn! 4 of those ships are on their way to us. They are hostile ships. The distance between them is just 12,000 meters." It took Takagi 3 minutes to recognize that his soldiers were no longer at action stations. Takagi bit his lip and told his soldiers to return to their combat stations. The big cruisers produced smoke to conceal their movements. Warship engines revved up to battle speed, and bugles and loudspeakers issued the order. The fleet hauled in the final seaplane and started its engines after 3 minutes. Takagi was aware that he was outnumbered because there were only 2 cruisers versus 4 Allied cruisers. Additionally, the enemy may be en route to his transports. Doorman had started looking for the enemy in the dark, first to the northeast and then to the northwest. He was unaware that Takagi's ships were recuperating planes while they sat there. The British destroyer Jupiter and 4 cruisers remained in his column. Exeter and her 2 escorts were en route to Surabaya. With no torpedoes and no fuel, the 4 American destroyers in a separate column were attempting to keep up. When Jinsu dropped a flare to light up the target, the new fight began. Perth and Houston fired at 7:33 p.m., but their shells were unsuccessful. To further illuminate their target, the Japanese retaliated with star shells. Waller thought the flashes he saw in the enemy column on Perth were torpedoes. All of the Allied ships followed his instruction to make a sharp turn to starboard. Fire was checked on all sides. Winslow and his fellow sailors on Houston witnessed the flares explode above their heads with a spooky greenish glow. He later said, "We stood by, terrified that the enemy was closing in for the kill, helpless as pinion ducks in a shooting gallery." It is believed that Doorman's anxiety that the Japanese convoy might move south and land was motivated by his ignorance about the convoy's location. In order to be in a better position to intercept the convoy, he decided to turn around and travel for the Java shore. In the growing moonlight, the Allied troops turned south at 7:55 toward the Javan coast. The force swung to starboard to parallel the coast at around 9 o'clock in the evening. Binford's 4 American destroyers roared along, consuming gasoline, behind Doorman's column of cruisers. "I'm not going in there after Doorman," Binford said to the deck officer on Edwards. "That Dutchman has more guts than brains." He gave the order for his ships to restock ammo and refuel at Surabaya. Since he was unable to speak with Doorman directly, he radioed the shore bases and requested that they inform Doorman of the situation. They didn't. Unaware that he had lost command of 4 of his ships, Doorman continued to steam. As a result, at 9:25 p.m., a massive explosion ripped through the hull of Jupiter, the destroyer at the end of Doorman's column, releasing smoke and flames into the atmosphere. The skipper of Jupiter gave the signal, "I am torpedoed," but Jupiter wasn't. Water poured in when the destroyer struck a stray Dutch mine that was part of a field that had just been deployed. The explosive had blasted apart the front bulkhead in the engine room. For 4 hours, damage control teams managed to keep the destroyer afloat. This made it possible for Jupiter's crew to use lifeboat davits and Carley floats to properly evacuate the ship. After surviving the sinking, some 78 of her crew members navigated their boats to the coast of adjacent Java. At 10:17, Doorman received this most recent awful news and changed his course to the north, passing through an area that was covered in life rafts from the previous losses. After being relieved as officer of the deck on Houston, Winslow went to the mainmast's forward AA director tower to rest for a little while before the battle's next phase. He had scarcely closed his eyes when he heard shouts to starboard and high-pitched whistles. He jumped up and noticed groups of men shouting in Dutch while intoxicated. Doorman gave Encounter the order to disengage from Exeter's escort and hurry back to the area to retrieve the survivors. Encounter discovered 113 Courtenaire survivors, including their commanding officer, Lieutenant R.A. Crows, after Houston marked the location with flares. By 11 p.m., Exeter and WW2 had returned to Surabaya and started refueling and maintenance. As Binford and his 4 ships prepared to enter the harbor, Doorman sent him a message via the intricate communications system, instructing him to proceed to Tanjong Priok for refueling and rearmament. Binford whirled around, then saw the pointlessness of it. After consulting with his other skippers, he concluded that rushing to Batavia without fuel or ammunition would be disastrous when confronted by Japanese ships and aircraft. He gave the order for his ships to replenish and bunker in Surabaya before leaving the Java Sea to the south. Doorman was returning to De Ruyter, where he would spend the final, most dramatic hour of both his life and the conflict. The Allied force was steaming north on a modest zigzag route, lacking ammunition, ships, and destroyer protection. Takagi continued to try to maintain distance between the shipments and the Allied ships, heading southward on a slightly convergent path. Both sides lacked radar and surveillance aircraft, therefore no one knew the other side's location. Both sides were observed at 11 p.m., with De Ruyter, Perth, Houston, and Java moving north, followed by Nachi and Haguro traveling south. Both sides fired at close range as the action was well lit by the moon. Neither side's gun crews were successful after a long afternoon of steaming and fighting. The range was narrowed to 8,000 yards on both sides. Against 11:22 p.m., Haguro sent 4 torpedoes against the Allied column, while Nachi fired 8. A little after 11:30 p.m., one of them struck De Ruyter, causing an explosion that engulfed the stern of the flagship in the flames. Flares and rockets flew into the night sky in a gaudy and horrifying fireworks display after the fire struck the pyrotechnics locker. In order to escape the explosion, De Ruyter's crew hurried to the bow of their ship. Waller noted that De Ruyter blew up with an appalling explosion and settled aft, heavily afire. "I thought it would fry us," a sailor from Perth claimed. "It happened with the suddenness and completeness that one sees in the functioning of a good cigarette lighter, a snap and a burst of flame. You could smell the terrible stench of burning bodies and burning paint since it was so close." When Paymaster Commander Owen saw the fire in front of him on Perth, behind De Ruyter, he considered it to be the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. Owen was thrown off his feet as Waller threw his cruiser into a sharp bend on Perth's bridge to avoid hitting De Ruyter. Perth came very close to colliding with the flagship. Rooks also took evasive action on Houston. Another Japanese torpedo struck Java while the 2 cruisers maneuvered, causing the other Dutch vessel to catch fire. The heat was felt by the crew on Perth. Captain P.B.M. Van Stalen gave the order for his crew to leave the ship as Java came to a standstill. The cruiser lifted nearly vertically as water filled Java's compartments. As the cruiser sank, Dutch sailors clambered and jumped over the sides and into the water. With 3 cheers for their ship and Queen Wilhelmina, almost 500 sailors made it through the oil-saturated waters and the sinking of Java. The cruiser De Ruyter was rocked by another huge explosion, and the ship's characteristic superstructure disappeared. When the ship's 40mm anti-aircraft ammunition began to explode, a senior officer gave the order for the crew to leave. Dorman sent out a final signal as the De Ruyter sank, instructing all ships to abandon the survivors and head for Batavia rather than wait by. Then, Admiral Carol Dorman joined 344 U.S. and Royal Netherlands Navy officers and soldiers. At the depths of the Java Sea, Navy Lieutenant Otto F. Kolb is seen with his staff. It was luckier for another American sailor. The U.S. submarine S-37, returning from a patrol, dragged signalman First Class Marvin E. Scholler out of the drink after he slid into the sea. In keeping with the finest customs of the Royal and Royal Australian Navies, Waller took quick action after realizing he was now a senior officer present aboard on Perth. For orders, ammunition, and fuel, he gave Perth and Houston the order to halt their fighting, feint southeast, and then steam quickly to Tanjong Priok. The Houston and Perth raced on into the night, Winslow writes. "We grieve bitterly for our comrades in arms, whose funeral pyres burned behind us." The largest surface naval conflict since Jutland, the Battle of the Java Sea, was over. Their assault of Java had been postponed by precisely 1 day, and the Japanese had won with ease. Furthermore, the Japanese invasion of Java could no longer be resisted by any Allied naval force. The Allied naval force would soon be extinct. It was time to leave, with fuel and ammo running low, leadership gone, and 2 cruisers severely damaged. In an attempt to cross the Sunda Strait by nightfall, Perth and Houston departed first, refueling at Tanjong Priok on February 28th and leaving that afternoon. Instead, they battled for about 2 hours in a doomed fire-away Flanagan against a Japanese force that was invading Java from the west. In addition to losing a minesweeper and a transport and forcing 3 transports to beach themselves, the Allied cruisers also caused damage to 3 destroyers. However, Perth and Houston were sunk by a barrage of Japanese artillery and torpedoes. 368 men from Houston and 307 men from Perth made it through the atrocities of Japanese prisoner-of-war camps. Exeter fixed and refueled at Surabaya. Having missed the action in the Java Sea, Exeter set sail late on February 28th with Encounter and Pope, which still had a full load of torpedoes. In an attempt to cross the Sunda Strait, she went first northeast and then west. None of the three ships ever arrived. All three were overrun by 4 Japanese cruisers that ambushed the ships. 149 men from Pope survived, whereas only 800 men from the 2 British ships made it out alive. The fate of Binford's 4 American warships was better. They sailed east via the Belize Strait after departing Surabaya late on February 28th and arrived at Fremantle, Australia on March 4th. For the remainder of the war, all 4 vessels served as convoys in the Atlantic and Pacific. Japanese troops landed on Java in the evening of February 28th and started to advance toward their targets. The defenders fell in spite of the best efforts of British tanks, Australian and Dutch troops, and American artillery. The Dutch East Indies gave up on March 9th. In 6 months, the Japanese had anticipated conquering the archipelago, which was rich in resources and oil. They completed it in 3. The Allies' defeat at the Battle of the Java Sea was caused by a number of factors. The first was that the Japanese force was stronger and had more troops than the Allies. The Japanese ships carried strong torpedoes, were up to date, and had crews that knew how to use them. Although the Allied sailors were veterans of extensive service, they were operating outdated ships with antiquated armaments and had not trained or collaborated for a considerable amount of time. The torpedoes of the American destroyers, which were built as early as 1916, failed to explode. Above all, the Dutch East Indies command structure was the first attempt by the Allies to establish a single multinational force. It lacked clear chains of command and authority, unity, cohesiveness, and standard communications protocols. Weapons and communications were standardized, tactics were streamlined, and command processes were more authoritative and transparent when multinational Allied troops invaded Sicily, Italy, France, Burma, and Germany later in the war. Beyond the country flags that flew over the attacking battleships, the multinational Allied fleet that returned to Java in 1944 to blast and shell Japanese installations and oil fields would not resemble the fleet that went down at the Java Sea. One of the regular contributors to WW2 History is author David Lipman. In addition to maintaining a website that chronicles the war's daily happenings, he has written on a variety of subjects.